Hi, Osama is here, and in this tutorial, I want to talk about two delay analysis methods from the AACEI RP 29R-03 forensic schedule analysis. These methods are MIP, which is short for Method Implementation Protocol 3.1, the as planned versus as built single base static gross, and MIP 3.2, as planned versus as built observational multiple base static periodic. And I wanted to cover both of them in one tutorial because they are exactly the same except for one difference. So it makes sense to cover both of them in one tutorial. If you don't know what single base or static mean, you're gonna know everything by the end of this tutorial. I'm gonna go briefly over the taxonomy of the RP 29R-03 for the delay analysis methods. We have 9 MIPs. We have 2 categories, observational and modeled. Under observational, we have static logic or dynamic logic. Under modeled, we have additive or subtractive. In this tutorial, I will cover both 3.1 and 3.2. Okay, so let's start with the 3.1, the as planned versus as built single base static gross. It's ideal for simple projects with short duration, projects where longest path is unlikely to change throughout the project. It's a gross review, and I'm gonna explain what is that. Legally, it is called total time claim. What do we need before we start using this method? According to the RP, we will look at the source validation protocol, SVP. The recommended ones are SVP 2.1 baseline validation. We want to validate the baseline because that's our as planned. SVP 2.2 as built validation. We want to make sure that as built or actuals are correct because it's basically as planned versus as built. So we need both. Or update validation. So you don't need both of them. Only one is enough because we don't use the schedule update itself as, XER file. If you are using Primavera, we need the actual data only, the as built records. So that's why we need 2.2 or 2.3. We also need the delay ID and quantification. Enhanced SVPs according to the RP not used in this method. What is the minimum implementation? We will collect as built data, actual start, actual finish dates, and actual duration. We will compare the as built against the baseline critical activities. We will compare the as built against the planned of critical activities. The planned start of critical activities against the actual start. Planned finish versus actual finish, planned duration against the actual duration. You want to also consider any extension of time granted or that has been granted, during the process. And I'm going to explain why in a second. Enhanced implementation. If you want to enhance your analysis, you use daily delay measure. You will create a table that compares the planned duration to the actual duration and determine the cause for each significant variance. Create a table that records the changes in the predecessor's logic. Do the comparison against late dates instead of early dates. And if the as-built data is available at the appropriate level, daily delay measure, DDM, can be used. I know it might be too theoretical for you at this stage. I'm just covering the content of the RP, but I'm gonna go over some practical example and everything will make sense very soon. Here is a demonstration of how we can implement the 3.1. The as planned is in red So this is the critical path activities in red, and I'm gonna compare my as-built against the critical path of the baseline. This is my as-built actual. In the first activity, I have delayed start and a delayed finish as well. In the second activity, I have early start. So the activity started ahead of schedule and the finish is delayed. In the last activity, I have delayed start and a delayed finish, and this is the project delay. It's very, very simple, easy to implement, and very straightforward. We will create a table that will look like that. It's only a demo, but it will help you understand the concept. For each activity, so these are the critical path activities of the baseline. For the excavation, I can see the planned start and compare it with the actual start. What is the variance of the start date? So I have 2 days variance, and if it's negative or delay, I decided to put them in parentheses so I can identify the delay. Planned finish versus actual finish, so 4 days in delay. Planned duration 16 against 18 days actual. Duration variance 2 days as extension. So overall the activity delay 4 days. Why? Because I finished the activity 4 days beyond the planned finish date. I'm gonna still need to record everything else because it will help me in my analysis. So for a delayed start, for example, you can mention remarks like site obstructions, or maybe some disruption by client for 3 days during the activity when it was executed. So there is so much going on here, and I'm gonna try to analyze the variance in start, finish, and duration. Compaction, planned start versus actual start, and it's the same concept will apply. So I'm gonna, but as you can see, I have 2 days gain. So I started that activity ahead of schedule by 2 days, and I'm gonna keep recording everything, and the overall activity delay is 3 days. Remarks, partial site obstructions during this period, for example. This method is observational because you only observe the delay. You only analyze the planned versus actual data. You don't model the delay. For example, in time impact analysis, you might add new activities, or in case of collapsed as-built, you delete activities. We do not make any changes here to model the impact. We use the as-built schedule. It's static because the whole method all the time mainly relies on a single set of CPM logic underlying the baseline or other planned schedule. I'm comparing everything against the baseline. So my measuring point or reference does not change. The logic does not change. It's one reference. So that's why it's static. In window analysis, like for example, the 3.3, which we will cover in another video, you compare update to an update. In this case, it's dynamic, but in 3.1, it's static because you are depending on a single set of CPM logic. It's gross because you perform the delay analysis all at once, one shot, and not in windows, steps or periodic intervals. If we go back for a second, so that's only a demo, but you're gonna have all critical path activities. You're gonna compare the planned against the actual all at once. So that's why it's gross. What are the advantages of this method? It's settable for short and simple projects. It's easy to understand and implement. You need minimum requirements to implement. You only need a baseline because that's your as-planned, and you compare it with the as-built. You don't need the schedule update itself, the XER file if you are using Primavera. You only need the actual dates, actual duration, the as-built, in other words. Disadvantages, there are many of them. because this method is really weak. I do not recommend it, but I wanted to explain it so you can have this, superior knowledge about delay analysis, and you become confident about your knowledge in all delay analysis methods. And that's why I am preparing all these tutorials. It is not suitable for large and complex projects because the critical path will change. It's as planned versus as built. But the schedule update critical path, it changes. It will most likely change in large and complex projects, but the measuring point does not. 1 year down the road, after the baseline, when you are progressing away from the baseline, the critical path will deviate. It will not remain the same. So it's more like theoretical. You are not keeping up to date with the changes and the dynamics of the project. This MIP does not identify as-built critical path. You only have a collection of the as-built records. You do not consider concurrency or pacing, because if you wanna calculate concurrency or contractor's concurrent delays, you wanna see how the contractor is progressing throughout the project, and it is not something that you can achieve using this method because it's a one shot, right? It's all at once gross. You're gonna compare the as-built versus the as-planned, so you don't have windows or any possibility to see how the contractor is progressing throughout the project. It does not easily segregate delay responsibility because it doesn't consider accumulation or chronological delays. As I mentioned before, for one example, I have excavation, and we can see only the actual start and the actual finish, but we don't really know what happened in between, right? In this period. Maybe I can see that there are 3 days delay in the activity, but maybe the contractor is responsible for 1 day delay and the employer is responsible for 2 days delay, but everything is diluted in the as-built analysis. You only see the actual, so there is no chance to model the impact or segregate responsibility. It's all embedded in the as-built data. It does not consider acceleration. Sometimes in window analysis, for example, you can see that there are 10 days delay in the project during this window, but the window after you have done some acceleration. So when you see the trend of project delays in windows, you're gonna identify acceleration, but the acceleration is already included in the as-built as well, in the MIP 3.1. There is no chance to calculate or identify acceleration. For example, one activity is ended up in delay. That's all you can see right now. But maybe in between, if the activity took 2 weeks, maybe you were in delay for some time, then you have done some acceleration, then you are in delay again. So these dynamics are helpful to segregate delay responsibility and calculate concurrency and acceleration as well. The more you progress away from the baseline schedule, the less accurate and reliable the analysis is. Okay, as I have mentioned before, because 1 year down the road, the critical path will most likely deviate from the baseline. That's why this method is good for projects where critical path will unlikely to change. But even if that's the case, you are still considering that the measuring point does not change. It's more theoretical. Anything beyond data date is an assumption. We try to make schedule changes throughout the project to refine the schedule. It is normal to make schedule changes. For example, out of sequence is a good example of the assumptions that are different from the real life right now or real case. You have assumed one sequence, for example, but the actual situation might have a different sequence, or maybe you can, in actual situation, you can start both activities, overlap, which should have been start to start, but in your baseline, you assume the finish to start. So there are many assumptions that we will disqualify the more we progress away from the baseline. The as planned versus as built 3.1 does not consider that because you are still comparing everything against the baseline. with all the assumptions and everything else. What are the uses? Suitable for projects that are short, simple, minimum logic changes, the critical path will unlikely to change. You can use this method if you have sufficient as-built data records that can be verified. I assume that you have done a good job in the data source validation as well, because your as-built is everything, right? You compare the as-built against the as-planned. So you must have verified and strong records of the as-built. Schedules that are developed with very poor scheduling and logic. So it might look nice in the baseline, but because you have so many problems with the logic, when you try to use the schedule update, it's very complicated because you have to make a lot of changes to make it reasonable again. So in some cases, if that's the case, you can use this method. Schedule updates are not available, for example. You don't need a schedule update. You need the as-built, maybe from the daily reports or any other way, but you need only the schedule updates, the as-built, not schedule updates. So maybe in some cases, in some projects, you don't have schedule updates. You only have the baseline and the as-built. But I have to say that, you must have a very special occasion to use this method because it's very theoretical. It has serious disadvantages. It is not very common. What are the limitations? The as-built must be correlated with planned data. For example, if you have an activity in the baseline, let's say excavation, it's a major activity, but let's assume, I'm just giving you an example, excavation. But there are no records about excavation in the daily reports or minutes of meeting or, weekly reports. There is no as-built. The as-built is not documented or recorded. You cannot use this method, or it will be a limitation, let's say, because if you have this issue in some major activities on the baseline critical path, then it will not be possible to perform the analysis because the as-built must be correlated with the planned data. So you can make a straightforward comparison. It is not suitable for large and complex projects or when the critical path will change. That's another limitation. You can use it to analyze the delays of the overall project, but not concurrency, as I mentioned before. I'm gonna go over the 3.2 as well because it's very similar to the 3.1, so it will make sense to cover both of them in one tutorial, except for one difference. The MIP 3.2, the as-planned versus as-built, observational, multiple base, static, periodic. It's ideal for simple projects with short duration. It is also suitable for projects where longest path is unlikely to change. It's almost the same as 3.1. The difference here is periodic review. In the 3.1, it was gross all at once, but in this case, in the 3.2, we're gonna have periodic review or window analysis. Legally, it is called modified total time claim. The SVP, as per the RP, we need the baseline validation. We need either the as-built or the update, like 3.1 as well. That's why there are many similarities to the 3.1. That's why I want to cover both of them in one tutorial. Delay ID and the quantification. We will also collect the as-built data, actual start, actual finish dates, and duration. And we will compare the as-built against the baseline critical activities, planned start versus actual start, planned finish versus actual finish, planned duration versus actual duration. This is the only difference. We will do the above in Windows using periodic progress. Perform the above analysis in Windows, sum the results at the end of each period, use the as-built data of the schedule updates, not the update itself. Okay, so we do window analysis, but we are not using the schedule update. We are using the as-built up to certain data date. And I'm gonna explain that in detail as well. we will compare the as-built data with the as-planned baseline. Okay, so this is very similar to what we have seen in the 3.1. In the 3.1, you have one table, right? You list the critical path activities, you show the planned, and you populate the as-built or actuals against the planned, and you have gross review or analysis. But in the 3.2, you will not do that one shot. You're gonna do it in periods. Okay, so here in this data date, in this window, so the first window is from the contract start to this data date. I'm gonna analyze what's going on. So I have delayed start here, delayed finish, delayed early start, okay, and that's it. I do not use the schedule update itself, okay? Again, I am only comparing the actuals up to date, up to this date, against the planned. Window 2, from this data date 1 to data date 2, what do we have here? Delayed finish and delayed start, okay, for two activities. Again, I'm comparing the actuals against the baseline. And this is the third window from data date 2 to project finish. It will look like that. So in the gross review of 3.1, we have one table. We list all activities. We will analyze the delays all at once. But in the 3.2, we're gonna have windows, as I mentioned, from contract start, which is 1st of January 2024 until the end of the month. I have two activities which occurred during this month. So I'm gonna have my analysis here. And for the rebar, I'm gonna go to the second window from 1st of February to 28th of February. I have one activity that occurred during this month or this window, and I'm gonna do the analysis. It's exactly the same. I just have different classification or categories. That's it. But it's the same concept. It's the same analysis as 3.1. But I just wanted to put them into categories based on when the activity occurred. That's it. The 3.2 is observational because you still observe the delay, i.e. analyzing the planned versus actual data. You don't model the delay, you don't add or delete activities to model the impact. It's static, still static. It's a window analysis, but it's still static because you are comparing everything against the baseline. You are relying on a single set of CPM logic. If you are familiar with the TIA window analysis, it's dynamic because you are comparing update to an update. But in the 3.2, it's still static because you are depending on one measuring point, which is the baseline, which is a single set of CPM logic. It's periodic because you perform the delay analysis in Windows using the periodic progress. What is the periodic mode of the 3.2? You can have fixed periods, the weekly or monthly basis, like fixed intervals. The table I showed you, if you remember, I had it on monthly basis, so that's a fixed period. Or variable windows. Maybe you wanna have the analysis in Windows, but the length of each window is not the same. It will depend on project phases, for example, or the delay events. 3.1 versus 3.2. Just because the 3.2 considers periodic analysis doesn't mean that it is better than 3.1. My opinion, they are both very, very weak methods because they are very theoretical. They have serious disadvantages and limitations. In my opinion as well, the 29R-03 shouldn't have included these methods. It's very theoretical. There are many weaknesses. It doesn't make sense. The results are not reliable, but maybe the AACEI wanted to cover everything, but that's my opinion. I do not recommend it. I am only preparing the tutorial to make you confident about your knowledge of delay analysis. So you will know how to speak up and communicate with the project parties, right? So that's the whole purpose, even though I'm against the 3.1 and the 3.2. So that's it for these methods, the MIP 3.1 and the 3.2.